So we left Todd, and that was our biology, and it was really kind of an interesting question because we had this issue of astronomy. So if you're dealing with geology and biology, then you've got to talk about astronomy and the stars. And as Danny Faulkner himself said at one point, this is what, in a sense, we know the least about. And in a weird way, it's actually, though one of the oldest sciences, it's also one of the newest in terms of our ability to see into space. Right. And really the phenomenal world of that, I guess, Edwin Hubble and others opened up to us during the 20th century. So the issue I found that was interesting, though, is most people don't think about the stars and time. And so when you look at the Bible and you see this, that if we're talking about that, basically in many cases the rocks, in a weird way, give us the evidence of catastrophe and show us the evidence of a young Earth, then you have in biology the evidence of a very complex system. In the heavens itself, if you reorient yourself biblically, you realize that it's just a big clock. In fact, many of the things that I was listening to a series on physics with a teaching company, one of the first things he talks about, how do we know what time is? Well, we know about it through the heavens. And it's the sun. You know, it's us going around the sun, or as we say, you know, sunrise and sunset. Even our language still falls along this idea that the sun rotates around us. Right. So the moon, the stars in their seasons, and going back to things like Stonehenge and Lagrange, all these early archaeological things are based on the sun and based on the moon, based on the stars. And so I think that we realize that God gave us the stars for time. And when you see that, it changes your view of the heavens. Not that it doesn't mean that the heavens are incredibly vast and that they're incredibly extraordinary. But someone that designed so much in this world with such fine detail, and if you're omniscient and omnipotent, what does it matter whether you make one world or billions of worlds? It's curious to us, but I think there's a lot more, as Paul said, than we can possibly understand. And I think there's a certain level of humility that, okay, it's out there, we don't understand it, but there's some curious things out there, even that the conventional view doesn't explain well. And I think that's a helpful thing to know, that there's a lot of things no one really, I think, has a good explanation for.
Yeah, I think of Psalm 19 that says, the heavens declare the glory of God. And in that statement, that anyone who has ever stood in the middle of the night, as I've done oftentimes, growing up with my dad, you know, hiking and hunting up in the woods and in the mountains and the Rocky Mountains and so forth, and you're out where there is no ground light, and you stand on a hill, and you look up into the heavens, and you see the mass of stars, that there is something that overwhelms you. And I think that is the sense of the majesty of God, that when God created the heavens and he made the stars also, that part of their function, if not their primary function, was to do just that. To overwhelm us with the majesty of God. And now, of course, we know that these stars are so far away it's hard for us to imagine how far away they are. But it brings our mind to the immensity of God's creation. That when he speaks, and he even names the stars, he knows their names, that immensity is but a word from God. And so I think yes, they're there. The Genesis account tells us that they're there for a purpose in terms of times and seasons and so forth. I think they even played in the part of announcing the birth of Christ.
Absolutely.
That boggles our minds even more to say that when God spoke the stars into existence and set them in their place, that he had already ordered the time in which Christ would then come.
No, it's a very curious thing because it tells us there's so much we don't understand about the world. That often people talk about the clockwork universe being up there, and you can take that a couple different ways. But that there is very much a clockwork world that we all live in, and we know it is, and yet set by a God that is also involved with it. I think that's important to realize. We're not deists, and we think that that's a rejection. He creates a creation that he is in. He's both immanent and transcendent. And in light of that, I know we had to make a choice when he chose Danny, and Danny said this, you know, he has one theory of the timeline that others do. You have some very good scientists who have different views. And I think Danny admits this. But I think it's important to realize that astronomy is fairly young too. The Big Bang Theory is a very recent view. And there are folks, the steady state guys or the plasma guys, that would say that's totally wrong. These are a lot of new views in astronomy. In that case, biology and geology is very old in terms of the theories they've had compared to astronomy. So I think that's important, and I also think it's important to realize that astronomy is the best example of paradigm shifts, but paradigms that also are held and that work. And we mentioned, maybe I mentioned it earlier, that the Ptolemaic universe, introduced by the Greeks. So Aristarchus of Samos, he was one of the early guys that believed in the heliocentric view of the world. The Pythagoreans, who were mathematicians, usually had a tendency to say, well, I think that maybe these structures can be explained mathematically. Aristotle, who did not care much for math, very much presented this idea of this geocentric view because it fit his model. When Copernicus, he was a Pythagorean, there were mathematical reasons for him and Galileo to think that, well, it made more sense for the universe to be, or at least the solar system, to be heliocentric, because it fit the math better. Here's what's interesting. There was not empirical data to support it. And there wouldn't be for 200 years. Michael Polanyi points this out. The telescopes weren't big enough. They didn't have the data. So when Galileo was making his arguments, he argued that it was a total perfect circle. He did not believe in ellipses. That wouldn't be till Kepler. And his arguments were made from math. So most people think, well, he just had better data. He didn't. In fact, the data could be used both ways very successfully. And it really was a paradigm that happened to be a more accurate paradigm based on the math that he was using. So that issue of talking about, well, we today are like the church pushing against Galileo, most people don't even understand the real issues that were going on there. And that Galileo, and Copernicus would not have liked Kepler, and they sure wouldn't have liked Newton, because they argued with the gravitational theory, Kepler with his three planetary laws, and the idea of ellipses. An ellipse is totally not geometrically nice. And then when you get to Newton, and then by the time you keep adding on, their universe and views of motion consistently have changed throughout the history of astronomy. And so the problem is so who is right? How do we get what's really true? And it goes back to this question of that much of it's the paradigmatic view of things. Not saying that these guys aren't accurately in some sense of looking at reality, but it gets hard, as Professor Stephen Goldman says in his series on Science Wars, what really is true and how do we know it? Is it more of a functional way of using and looking at the world? And I think these are the challenging things that all people who look at science have to try to grapple with, is that how do we know a world that is so much more complex than we can understand? And I think that's where you step back to this glory of God. You can see the glory of God in the complexity of the universe, or the complexity of the cell, or the complexity of the interrelationships of animals, that there is so much we don't understand. And I think that humility is very important for all scientists and those of us who want to do science. And the stars I found very compelling in that way.
I think the other thing that we have to consider here, and that is that when we look at a tree, when we look at a plant, when we look at a human cell and so forth, we know that those things that we're looking at have come from a series where one fig tree produces a seed, that seed becomes another fig tree, and so forth. But when we look at the stars, we are actually looking at, if we look at it from a Genesis paradigm, we are looking at the creative act of God. We're not looking at the original tree when we see a tree. We're not looking at the original human when we study a human being. But when we look at the stars, we are looking at the original created work of God.
It's very interesting.
And when we do that, we have to recognize that trying to use science to figure out how they got there is problematic from a biblical, from a Christian worldview perspective. It's the same problem that would be confronting a chemist who was at the wedding of Cana, who is now trying to figure out how that wine got there
when it was water just a minute or two before.
2 seconds ago. And his attempt to try and do that with natural processes and natural understandings of how wine is made would be deeply problematic, and he most likely would come up with a wrong answer unless he recognizes the historical event that Jesus, I don't know whether he spoke it or not, the text doesn't tell us, but the act of Jesus to take those 6 barrels of water and turn them into wine, he was now looking at the direct result of a creative moment. And when we look at the stars, we're looking at the direct end result of a creative moment. And that is why I think it will always be problematic for us if we attempt to try to always explain stars and starlight and everything else from a naturalistic perspective.
Yeah, I think you're standing on air, trying to climb up to the heavens on air.
Yeah.